Hello everyone, welcome to our channel with another spine-chilling story. Listen to this full story completely, sit tight, grab popcorn, and let's begin. This story is about the events that happened with a group of 4 friends, Chris, David, Mark, and James, in the dark, remote wilderness of Blackwood Forest in Scotland. It was the year 1998. And what was supposed to be a fun camping trip turned into a night they would never forget. Chris, David, Mark, and James had known each other since high school. They were more like brothers than friends, always going on adventures and daring one another to push their limits. Each of them had a different background and personality, but that's what made their friendship so solid. Chris was the fearless leader of the group, always seeking out the most dangerous trails and wild experiences. He was never afraid of taking risks, whether it was climbing the highest peaks or venturing into unknown territory. David, on the other hand, was the practical one, the skeptic. He had always been the one to organize their trips and keep everything in check. Mark was the joker, the life of the party, always making light of tense situations. But he was also deeply spiritual, with a strange fascination for the supernatural. James, quiet and thoughtful, was the one who often noticed things that others didn't. He was observant, and though he spoke little, his words always carried weight. It was Chris's idea to go camping deep in Blackwood Forest. He had heard about it from a fellow hiker, a place so remote and isolated that it had become almost mythical. It was rumored to be haunted, but Chris didn't care about ghost stories. To him, Blackwood Forest was just another challenge, a place few dared to go. Mark, however, wasn't so sure. He had read about the forest's dark history, a history full of disappearances and strange occurrences that had never been explained. But David laughed off his concerns, chalking them up to overactive imagination. He was confident that the stories were just that, stories. The drive to Blackwood Forest took hours. They left the nearest town, Kinross, at dusk, and by the time they arrived, it was already dark. The road twisted and turned through the dense trees, and as they got closer, the forest seemed to swallow the light. They set up their camp in a small clearing, far from any trails, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to reach into the sky. The air was cool, almost too cool for late October, and there was a stillness that hung heavy over the forest. They built a bonfire and sat around it, joking and telling stories as they always did. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the trees, but they were too busy enjoying themselves to notice. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. He wasn't the only one. James, ever the quiet observer, also seemed tense, though he said nothing. It was as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting. Then David, in his usual playful manner, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, his beam cutting through the darkness. At first, it was just a joke, an attempt to scare Mark. But then something moved. David froze, his heart skipping a beat. He thought he saw a shadow shift among the trees, something that didn't belong. He quickly turned the flashlight off, laughing nervously, trying to play it off as a trick of the light. But Chris noticed the look on his face. "What was that?" Chris asked, standing up and grabbing his own flashlight. David shrugged, trying to keep his cool. Probably just a deer or something. But Chris wasn't convinced. He aimed his light at the same spot, and for a moment nothing happened. The trees stood still, silent. But then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw it. Movement. A figure, pale and elongated, darted between the trees, too fast to be human. His breath caught in his throat, and for a second he felt genuine fear. David, Mark, and James saw it too, but none of them said a word. It wasn't until they all looked at each other that the tension broke. "Let's just get some sleep," David said, trying to sound nonchalant, though his voice shook slightly. They reluctantly agreed and headed into their tents, but the strange feeling lingered. The bonfire slowly died out, casting the clearing into darkness. Inside the tents, the four friends lay in their sleeping bags, but none of them could sleep. The wind rustled the trees, making soft, eerie noises that seemed to creep into their minds. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching them. Chris was the first to hear it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. At first, he thought it was just an animal, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from outside his tent, moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. He nudged David awake and they both listened, their hearts pounding. The scratching continued, circling the tent. It wasn't just random, it was as if something was inspecting the tent, testing it. David grabbed his flashlight, but Chris stopped him. "Don't," Chris whispered, "just listen." The scratching moved to Mark and James's tent. Mark had already woken up, his heart racing as he heard the same sound. James lay still, wide-eyed, as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. They exchanged nervous glances but stayed silent, not daring to move. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent once more, but the tension remained thick in the air. No one spoke. They waited, holding their breath, unsure of what had just happened. Then, without warning, there was a loud thud. Something heavy hit the side of Mark and James's tent, causing the entire structure to shake. Mark yelped, scrambling to get out of his sleeping bag, but James grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Wait," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Outside, the sound of footsteps circled their tent. Slow, deliberate. Whatever it was big, and it was walking on two legs. The footsteps paused right outside the tent flap. Mark's heart was in his throat as he stared at the fabric, half expecting it to tear open at any moment. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. Chris, who had been listening from the other tent, grabbed his flashlight and slowly unzipped the flap. He shone the light outside, sweeping it across the clearing. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying in the cold wind. But then, as he moved the beam to the edge of the clearing, he saw it again. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood among the trees, its skin pale and eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It watched him, unblinking, unmoving. Chris's hand shook as he pointed the light at it, but the figure didn't react. It just stared, as if waiting for something. "David," Chris whispered, his voice trembling. "Look." David crawled over and peered outside, his eyes widening in horror. "What the hell is that?" Before Chris could answer, the figure moved. It darted between the trees with inhuman speed, disappearing into the darkness. Chris quickly zipped the tent back up, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever it was still out there, watching them. For the rest of the night, they stayed huddled in their tents, too scared to move. The forest was silent, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, harboring some ancient, malevolent force. By morning, the sun's weak rays filtered through the trees, and the friends slowly emerged from their tents, exhausted and shaken. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but something felt different. The forest had changed, as if it had come alive during the night. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Chris, usually the bravest of the group, nodded in agreement. "Let's pack up." They quickly gathered their gear, their eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of the figure. But the forest was still. As they packed, Chris noticed something strange. Deep scratches in the bark of the trees surrounding their campsite. Long, jagged lines, as if something with claws had been circling them all night. They didn't stick around to investigate. They grabbed their backpacks and made their way back to the trail. their pace quickening with every step. The forest felt oppressive, as if it was closing in on them, urging them to leave. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent their hearts racing. But as they neared the edge of the forest, Chris stopped dead in his tracks. Standing in the middle of the trail, blocking their path, was the figure. It was taller now, its limbs elongated, its face a twisted mask of pale skin and empty eyes. The air around it seemed to crackle with a dark energy. For a moment, no one moved. The figure stood still, watching them, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Then, without warning, it rushed toward them, its movements unnaturally fast. The friends scattered, running in different directions. Chris and David bolted down the trail, their legs burning with exhaustion. Mark and James veered off into the woods, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they sprinted through the underbrush. The figure chased after them, its footsteps pounding the ground behind them. Mark tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. James skidded to a stop, reaching down to help him up, but the figure was already upon them, its clawed hand reaching out. James grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the creature, but it passed through its form as if it were made of smoke. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes burning with anger. Just as it seemed like all hope was lost, a blinding light pierced through the trees. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. Chris and David had found a clearing, where the sun shone down through the trees. The figure let out an ear-piercing screech and dissolved into the shadows, disappearing into the forest. They regrouped in the clearing, panting and shaking with fear. The sun was rising higher now, and the forest no longer felt so oppressive. The friends didn't waste any time. They hurried back to their car and drove away from Blackwood Forest, vowing never to return. Though they made it out alive, they knew that the forest would always be there, waiting. Some places were not meant for humans, and some things were better left undisturbed. Like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing horror stories.